Thanks for all coming. I wasn't expecting to see such a full room because Rupert Sheldrake's upstairs, but thanks all for coming down to this one. It's probably more interesting. So I'm going to talk about humour, comedy. The words are sort of interchangeable. I probably will interchange them a bit. The reason I'm talking about it is because I kind of stumbled on it through my masters, but then I realised it wasn't really something that people have paid much attention to within psychedelic research at all, or necessarily within their own experiences. It's kind of put as a byproduct. But I'm going to kind of put my cards on the table and say, really, it's the most important thing. Laughter is universal. If you haven't laughed during a psychedelic trip, then you've been doing it all wrong. Everyone kind of picks their psychedelic trip buddies based on who they know and trust and who they have things in common with, which is all very true, and it's important to keep you safe. But first and foremost, I kind of make sure that I'm with people that I know we're just going to absolutely crack each other up. And I think it's really important. I'm going to speak about, I guess, from a philosophical standpoint, what comedy is, what humour is. So I looked at Henri Bergson very briefly, really, just to sort of get a definition during my masters. My thesis was on Bill Hicks pretty exclusively. I'm going to touch on him towards the end when I sort of touch on stand-up comedy. So Bergson looks at laughter as something which is intrinsically human. Nature isn't funny, although we might look at animals that remind us of friends or different humans, and that might make us laugh, but that's because we have put the kind of human features onto it. So really, it kind of appeals to intellect. Bergson makes the distinction of walking into a room where loads of people are dancing, but you can't hear the music, and it would look absolutely ridiculous. Moving on from that as well, kind of laughter serves as a purpose in a moral way, in a social way, in a kind of revealing and unravelling way, possibly in the same way that psychedelic drugs do. There's different kind of characters, figures that I'm going to touch on that kind of outline this idea of not necessarily humour per se, but living in a certain way which reveals certain things. So there's a character called Diogenes. I don't know if anyone's heard of Diogenes. He was a Greek philosopher. I kind of see him as sort of like the original troll in a way. So he was walking around and he saw a snail going around and he thought, oh yeah, why would I have a house when I could just like get a barrel and just, walk along with a barrel and live in a barrel, and then I can go from place to place. And then he ended up having like loads of dogs living with him, and he was kind of just seen as this weird type of person. The famous story about Diogenes, where I think he's kind of a real troll. So a lot of people around Greece had heard about him as this kind of crazy man who kind of wandered the streets and just kind of freaked out the people who are, higher up in society and everything. And Alexander the Great hears of him, and he travels kind of long distances to meet Diogenes. And he sees Diogenes, and Diogenes is kind of crumpled up against a wall with the sun on his face, just kind of not really paying attention to anything. And Alexander the Great comes up to him and says, Diogenes, this famous philosopher, I've travelled many miles to hear what you have to say. No, go, tell me what you have to say. He goes, you just move a little bit, you're blocking the sunlight, mate. So, this man here kind of saying to Alexander the Great, get out of the way, I don't really care what you're doing. It's this idea of kind of dispelling these fixed notions, which I think humour really serves to do. Some other characters, I got quite interested in kind of Zen philosophy and Zen Buddhism, particularly things like Koans, this whole idea of shaking people out of their mindset. There's a few kind of figures in more towards this idea of crazy wisdom, divine madness, and I think this kind of madness goes hand in hand with humour, really. So one character was a 9th century Zen poet Han Shan, who almost in a sort of Yoda sense, when anyone would come up to him and say, please tell me about Zen Buddhism, he would just kind of laugh hysterically and walk away. And it was this kind of embodiment of like, well, you're never going to get there. The same, there was a Zen master, Ikkyu, would run around his town with a skeleton kind of on his back to demonstrate the grim reality of life, and that, we shouldn't really be holding on to anything because we've always got this shadow of death upon us. So, Then as well, I looked at Sufism. There was a character called Mullah Nasreddin, who there's lots of these different stories, which is similar to kind of Zen Koans, this idea of shaking people out of their mindset. There's a famous story about him. He's standing outside his house with a book, just kind of tearing bits of paper out, scattering them all over the ground. And someone comes up to me and says, "Mullah Nasreddin, what are you doing?" He said, "Well, I'm, tearing up the paper to keep the tigers away." He goes, "Yeah, but there aren't any tigers around here." It's like, you see how well it works. So there's this kind of tradition of getting yourself out of yourself, what kind of Greeks called ecstasis, what we experience a lot of the time in these psychedelic experiences, particularly when laughing. For me, in those moments of laughter, possibly, I would say something like mushrooms, it really kind of brings the laughter out of you. And you are really kind of stepping outside of yourself and entering into this kind of crazy moment where you think you're just going to end up laughing forever and ever, and you'll go mad if it doesn't stop. But at the same time, it's absolutely amazing. And it's like, I think it's like the highest kind of point of divination, because you're connecting to something which is really universal, like laughter, and you're completely going out of yourself. I'm going to touch on that a bit more with stand-up comedy, how we kind of process stand-up comedy. And I'll give an example again, just touching back on mushrooms. And it was really actually this experience I had that made me think about laughter and psychedelics and how important laughter really is. I was sat in my garden on quite a strong dose of Liberty Caps, and I was getting to the point where I was thinking about the universe, and I was like, okay, the universe is everything, it's everywhere, okay, but like, where is it? And it's like, well, it's just everything and everywhere. And I was getting a bit sort of philosophically stuck, and I was just like, well, what? I don't understand how, like, things are in places. How can it be everything and everywhere? And I thought of it as this kind of cruel joke in a way, that we couldn't wrap our heads around it, that this thing was just like completely incomprehensible. And then for some reason unbeknownst to me, because of the mushrooms, I saw Will Rowlandson in my mind as a small water vole on the side of a riverbank, popping his head up, just being like, yeah, don't worry about it, mate, it's funny, it's great, it's all a big joke, it's all like, wait, just like the universe sticking its tongue out at you, just like, yeah, it doesn't make any sense, go figure. And then I went from being kind of philosophically stuck, kind of in my garden, just like, ugh, to head first in the bushes, just absolutely laughing my arse off. Got back inside, then again crippled to the floor with laughter. Really in this sort of kind of ecstatic state, which you find in a lot of kind of yogic traditions in sort of Tibetan Buddhism. There's these kind of mad yogis who would just kind of get into these crazy states. And in Hinduism, well, there's these traditions in different yogic practices. So I kind of thought of this thing as like, this is really core. And actually it can help us in the psychedelic experiences. Because when we get to this point where we possibly stumble upon something that's a bit dark or we don't understand, it's not necessarily that we have to understand it, but that we understand that we don't have to understand. And that's okay, and it kind of, we can laugh at it, not in a way where we diminish its importance, but kind of diminish the effect that it has on us. And then moving from there, I think that's why stand-up comedy is really kind of important. And I think it can learn a lot from psychedelic experiences. Particularly, there's a kind of strand of stand-up comedy that I looked at. Coincidentally, they were kind of all comedians that were influenced by drugs, not necessarily psychedelic drugs. People like George Carlin, Richard Pryor, even Eddie Murphy, Joe Rogan, Doug Stanhope. All of these guys they like to dabble, and I think it definitely influenced them. Particularly people like George Carlin, who was an actor, and then when he really got into kind of cocaine and LSD, his act just completely changed into this very kind of highly energetic, crazy, angry but very funny kind of act. I'm going to play you a short clip from Bill Hicks that you might have heard before. Has it gone again?
Oh, it's back, yes.
Okay, so this is him talking about mushrooms, and again it's an example of how his personal psychedelic experience has influenced his comedy, and I'm guessing most of you know Bill Hicks and the kind of comedy that he has. I mean, there's not much of it really that's about psychedelics. Most of it is kind of about American society. You know, he grew up in Texas. Everything was big business, NASA. His dad was in General Motors. He came from a Baptist family. He was in a very rigid kind of mindset, but he'd always kind of had this inkling towards psychedelics, very kind of interested in like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and all of these kind of weird things. So as we all know, I think we can agree you kind of have to have this inkling already to become interested in psychedelics, to have that psychedelic experience. But what it can do for you, particularly creatively and particularly in terms of comedy, it can really just unlock a lot of stuff. And I think for Bill Hicks, it allowed him to touch upon the darker sides of life and really kind of make a mockery of it, which you'll see here. This is him talking about the kind of effect of mushrooms.
Yeah. Well, once again, I recommend a healthy dose of psilocybin mushrooms. 3 weeks ago, 2 of my friends and I went to a ranch in Fredericksburg, Texas, and took what Terence McKenna calls a heroic dose. 5 dried grams. Let me tell you, our third eye was squeegeed quite cleanly. Wow! And I'm glad they're against the law. Because you know what happened when I took them? I laid in a field of green grass for 4 hours going, my God, I love everything. The heavens parted, God looked down and rained gifts of forgiveness onto my being, healing me on every level, psychically, physically, emotionally. And I realized our true nature is spirit, not body, that we are eternal beings, and God's love is unconditional, and there's nothing we can ever do to change that. It is only our illusion that we are separate from God or that we are alone. In fact, the reality is we are one with God, and He loves us. Now, if that isn't a hazard to this country, you see my point. How are we going to keep building nuclear weapons? You know what I mean? What's going to happen to the arms industry when we realize we're all one? It's going to fuck up the economy. The economy that's fake anyway. Which would be a real bummer, You can see why the government's cracking down on the idea of experiencing unconditional love.
Okay. And certainly, as I mentioned before, people like Joe Rogan, who to a certain extent has tried to carry the flame of Bill Hicks. Joe kind of, I guess, sees humans as this kind of weird virus. He's had a lot of strange experiences where he's kind of viewed humans as this weird kind of destructive force in the universe. But Bill Hicks kind of takes this more spiritual light, that we are the kind of holy children of God, and God loves us unconditionally. In my master's thesis, I drew parallels between Bill Hicks and Gnosticism. I don't know how much time I've got really to go into any of that.
If you want some speaking time,
no, that's fine. One thing I was going to mention, just for point of interest, another kind of group of people who act in this sort of way, group of what's widely known more as sacred clowns, Pueblo clowns, in the Lakota tradition in Native America. you have these things called the Heyoka, who in ceremonies they will do things kind of backwards. They'll ride a horse backwards, they'll wear clothes backwards, they'll lie in a puddle and scream that they're drowning. And this is there to actually reinforce the cultural norms. When I was kind of looking at it in terms of resistance, it didn't really actually come to that, because these people are there to actually ground people within the society, help people read between the lines. I think that's what comedy really does, is that it helps us read between the lines. It helps us not take life so seriously, because life's absolutely mental. I mean, we've got, religious fundamentalists running our country now. It's all absolutely nuts, everything that's going on. So it's kind of, I'll leave you with one of my favourite quotes, which is from Hunter S. Thompson, which is, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. So in these kind of situations, we just really have to kind of get a bit sillier, because otherwise, I don't know what else we're going to do.